Welcome to today's event. My name is Kyle Jarris, and I'm an associate professor of global affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs and a faculty fellow of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. The Liu Institute is one of 9 international institutes that make up the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Institute's main objectives are to coordinate Asian studies research and teaching across the university, to encourage Notre Dame students to study in Asia, to promote academic collaboration with Asian universities, and to organize public events pertaining to Asia. This academic year, the Institute is hosting a series entitled Asian Revisions of Nation State and Citizenship that invites scholars from multiple disciplines to examine how diverse populations in Asia are remaking discourses and practices of nation state and citizenship with consequences for people in Asia and around the globe. On behalf of the Liu Institute and my fellow organizers of the series, Professor Julia Kowalski and Sharon Yoon, I'm very pleased today to welcome Professor Jeremy Wallace for today's lecture. Professor Wallace is one of the leading experts on the workings of China's contemporary authoritarian governance and its evolution under Xi Jinping. He is an associate professor of government at Cornell University, and he holds a PhD in political science from Stanford University. Professor Wallace's work has probed various aspects of authoritarian politics and policy making, looking at how China manages urbanization, confronts climate change, uses or misuses statistical data, and how it holds local officials accountable through political discipline and campaigns. His work has appeared in leading political science and area studies journals, including the Journal of Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, the American Political Science Review, the International Organization, and the China Quarterly. He also serves as an editor at the Monkey Cage and writes the China Lab newsletter. He is the author of the acclaimed study, Cities and Stability, Urbanization, Redistribution, and Regime Survival in China, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2014, and is soon to publish a new book, Seeking Truth and Hiding Facts, Information, Ideology, and Authoritarianism in China, which he'll be speaking about today. During the event, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now, with great pleasure, I yield the floor, or at least the Zoom room, to Professor Jeremy Wallace. Please take it away.
Thank you for that introduction. That was very generous, very kind. I remember talking with Kyle, with Professor Jarros, about urbanization issues in many years ago, before even that book was published. Let alone his kind of outstanding study as well. So let me share my screen so I can make sure that we can do this. Does everyone see my slides? Is that, I will assume it is working, unless I hear otherwise in the chat. Great. So as was stated, my name is Jeremy Wallace. I am a associate professor of government at Cornell. For this year, I am at Georgetown's Mortara Center for International Studies on sabbatical. And I am very excited to share this kind of like this talk with you, as it is, I believe, fingers crossed, the last book talk I will give before I send off the manuscript. And so I do appreciate your comments and thoughts. In particular, those you may notice that this image is devoid, or this kind of like first slide is devoid of imagery. And so if you have thoughts about what a book cover for this particular project would be, or are a designer yourself, please let me know. I am taking all comers at this point. It's hard to think about a book, what exactly a cover would be for a book on quantification and Chinese politics. So with that being said, the kind of the title of the book comes from this kind of famous, or at least in Chinese politics, in Chinese studies, kind of famous expression, seek truth from facts, which has historical kind of antecedents in kind of classical period, but in particular is associated with Deng Xiaoping and kind of reform era politics in China. The second quote from Balzac is more about the idea of numbers and the role of numbers in politics, which is one of the major themes and theoretical kind of contributions, I would argue, in the book. On March 5th, 2013, outgoing premier of China, Wen Jiabao delivered his final government work report before an audience of thousands of National People's Congress deputies. It was not exactly a barn burner. He continued at length There are almost always images of kind of deputies falling asleep during these work reports. Kind of explicating the regime's successes, laying out tasks for the future. And he did so in quantified terms. So talking about 18 million government subsidized housing units were built, kind of upgraded reservoirs, kilometers of new rail lines and roads, airports and shipping berths. And at no point in time did he mention any individual citizens, elite politicians, anyone, until his final sentence, which included a reference to the leadership of the party central committee with Comrade Xi Jinping as its general secretary, the new kind of incoming regime. So not 4 months or 6 months later, the contrast could hardly have been greater. This is an image of Xi Jinping at democratic life meetings, what are referred to as democratic life meetings in Hebei province. And these, as opposed to kind of a boring droning on of quantified facts, were described very differently. Kind of a sweating and on the verge of tears, politicians kind of who had been on the receiving end of thousands of public comments and criticisms, litanies of personal failings and mistakes served as the basis for these self-criticisms. And these apologia were not kind of in closed rooms only, but were broadcast for all to see. And in particular, I want to draw attention to a statement, which is one of the statements that drew me into this, this book, or the version of the book that you're seeing now. This is a statement from Zhou Benshun, who was the party secretary at the time in Hebei, the top official of the Chinese Communist Party there. And he made a self-criticism where he admitted carelessness, laziness, bureaucratic thinking, and then apologetically added, "I cared very much about development speed and economic volumes, but not as much about the people's interests." For a Chinese local official to care too much about GDP feels oxymoronic after decades of statements and reports like the one Wen Jiabao had delivered a short time before. The public relations job of Chinese officials seemed mostly to be about standing in front of kind of party members and bragging about these statistics and reaching new economic benchmarks. These numbers were the principal face of Chinese politics to the citizenry, investors, and the outside world. An explicit attack on the quantitative metrics of performance that dominated this discourse, especially in the context of open emotional displays of conflict within the party state, points to serious changes in Chinese politics. Indeed, these broadcasts were but one of a series of similar public presentations that shifted what I refer to as a neopolitical turn in China. You can see this changing discourse. This is not just one example, but one of the major metrics of kind of economic growth in China that is often used is GDP, gross domestic product. And so this image that you see on this slide is the rise and fall of what I call GDP supremacy, that is, or GDP-ism, it is sometimes referred to. That is kind of the dominance of a single indicator of economic growth as the end-all be-all, sometimes referred to in Chinese or in studies about China as performance legitimacy. That is, the regime is legitimate because it performs well. And in particular, what is the performance? What is the kind of metric? It is this metric of GDP and GDP growth. And so what you see here is mentions of GDP, the term GDP, in the People's Daily, the major Chinese newspaper of the party, the party's mouthpiece, it's often referred to. And GDP is an increasing kind of like presence on the headlines in the headlines of People's Daily, until around 2012, when we do see a real change in discourse and a real drop-off in GDP supremacy. And so the question that motivates this book is, how did a revolutionary communist party come to justify itself through statistics? And why is it currently shifting away from doing so? And so what do I mean by these questions? Well, let me give you a brief snippet of an answer, the one-sentence version. A few numbers came to define Chinese politics until they did not count what mattered, and what they counted did not measure up. So if you can keep that sentence in mind, that is the kind of like the core thesis of this book, Seeking Truth and Hiding Facts. And what do I mean by this? So a few numbers came to define Chinese politics. As I was saying, GDP in particular was this kind of major number. And as long as GDP growth was going up and was strong, everything was fine. The world was the CCP's oyster. Instead, but after a period of time, until they did not count what mattered. What do I mean by they did not count what mattered? Increasingly, it doesn't matter if GDP growth is going up if you can't walk outside of your apartment because of the air pollution. If that apartment building is constructed on kind of like massive terrain of debt and has no chance of paying back its debts, then what is the economic security of the Chinese state? If all of the if that building was built through corrupt deals between the leadership and kind of its cronies, what does that say? Is that truly a legitimate government? And yet the second part of that, what they counted did not measure up, even beside all of those problems, all those things that were not being measured under the initial few numbers. There was the other problem, which was that growth was slowing, and one does not want to be in the game of justifying your regime by growth when growth numbers are no longer going to be as strong as they were. And so this is the kind of theme of the argument, that for a long time, a few numbers came to define Chinese politics. They were amazingly successful and part of one of the great growth stories of the 20th and 21st century. But eventually they have kind of that tool has run out of use and is being shifted away from today. So kind of 5 themes or kind of big picture takeaways from the book manuscript. 3 broadly about authoritarianism in political science, and 2 more specifically about China and Asia, kind of more probably in keeping with the themes of this lecture series. The first, coercion, co-optation, and convincing. Authoritarian regimes endure, but coercion and co-optation alone do not hold them together. It's not just guns and it's not just money that holds regimes together, but there are arguments, there are ideas, and ideas are something that political science has not spent as much time kind of studying and examining then. And so one of the pieces of this book that I'm trying to do is try to look at the ways in which authoritarian regimes convince both their populations as well as themselves, and how that is part of regime maintenance or regime stability for authoritarian regimes. The second is mass politics shaping elite politics. One of the things that we know from this recent surge in authoritarianism literature that's happened in political science is that most authoritarian regimes are not ousted by massive protests on the street. That kind of fear is there and that matters, but it is in fact most of the time elites kind of like oust other dictators through coups or some other maneuver, assassination, something along those lines. And so because of that, the political science literature has gravitated toward elite studies, kind of thinking about the kind of like intra-elite dynamics of authoritarian regimes. And so one of the points of this study is to re-emphasize or remind that kind of mass politics shapes those elite politics. So even if in the end, the political regime is ousted by a coup, the mass political support that the regime has or didn't have underlies and kind of like is part of that causal process. And then finally, the book posits a framework to think about authoritarian regimes that kind of incorporates 3 questions. Who is the regime? How does it rule? And why? Why is it kind of ruling? And that these are contested inside of the regime as well as external to it. Again, political science is focused mostly on questions of who and how, understandably, because those are more obvious and kind of easier to measure, harder to argue with, and kind of more fundamental at some level. Until you know who a regime is and you can find the patterns there, it doesn't necessarily make sense to really dive into kind of the why debates, the ideological debates. But increasingly, especially work by Barbara Geddes and her co-authors and others kind of really started this authoritarianism literature along a dimension of thinking about different types of authoritarian regimes and that they have different politics and explaining differential survival rates because of those differences. That's That's who. And then how. We've had lots of wonderful studies about the coercive apparatuses of regimes, the ways in which regimes dole out money or incorporate potential adversaries. But as I was saying, we haven't studied as much the why issues, the arguments that regimes make, again, to themselves and their populations. And so this study in particular, in addition to just dealing with those broad questions, tries to think about quantification as a political tool that is quite useful in authoritarianism. And as a political technique, it has significant strengths, particularly for authoritarian regimes. Quantification imparts an aura of objective truth, transparency, and scientific authority to decisions. It digests reality's complexities to a few simple numbers. Quantification appears to aid accountability without democracy by generating commonly understood numerical benchmarks and facilitating comparisons, yet it simultaneously empowers the elites that create the metrics under evaluation. And so when we think about kind of the quantitative tools that the Chinese government used to justify itself and to kind of rule, we can think about quantification as kind of this interesting political tool that governments of all kinds use, but particularly amenable to authoritarianism. And then more directly in the Chinese reform era of the past 40 years, I argue that the regime has used this, what I refer to as a system of limited quantified vision. That is, after kind of a long period where you had kind of a dictator on the top of the regime, Mao Zedong, who was very interested in total control and total vision. The replacement to that was kind of a decentralized, allowing localities to move, and the center was going to focus on a few particular numbers and look into localities and local performance and judge performance based on just a few numbers, and allow the kind of like however you achieve those numbers is your own business. And this decentralization, pragmatic decentralization, focusing on these few numbers is a way to think about China's reform era. Its kind of successes, failures, and its ultimate denouement. And so the structure of the book, I won't try to talk about all of these things today, but the structure of the book looks like this. Like many books, it's chronological in its orientation. That is, it proceeds forward in time, as time is not a flat circle. I don't know any other way to move. After introducing the kind of core arguments of the book in the first chapter and developing the theoretical apparatus in the second chapter, kind of began thinking about, in the third chapter, thinking about the origins of reform, the initial debates that were happening in the 1970s, late 1970s, about kind of thinking about decentralization, thinking about pragmatic visions, thinking about seeking truth and from facts, as opposed to kind of ideological utopianism of Mao. Then chapter 4 thinks about the aftershocks. It begins and ends with protest waves, the 1978 protests of Democracy Wall and the 1989 protests of Tiananmen, and kind of the movement around China at the time. In thinking about the ways in which going from a revolutionary communist regime to a much more kind of like a regime that accepted capitalist practices to a much greater extent, how that reverberated inside of a complicated political system. Chapter 5 looks at the ways in which this regime worked, this kind of limited quantified vision worked to produce massive economic growth and political returns to the regime. And then what I'm going to focus on in this talk today are the 6th and 7th chapters, kind of the ways in which the regime, kind of the system of limited vision, kind of like began to crumble, the ways in which kind of that which was unseen or unnoticed or out of focus became increasingly obvious and problematic. And then 7th, this is the neopolitical turn, the ways in which the regime kind of like shifted in order to deal with these problems rather than just ignoring them. As a side note, I sometimes talk about this as a book where the conclusion has eaten the book. That is that I used to kind of end the book, or I was planning on ending the book on chapter 6, kind of the problems of the system, and kind of think about, well, what are the ways in which they will inevitably have to change, or how will they address this? But books take time to write, and over time it became clearer and clearer that, in fact, these kind of like these major movements had already begun, and so I needed to incorporate those into the book. The conclusion is, and one could argue, in fact, I think one should argue correctly, that these changes are really still coming and to this day. And so I could imagine a different version of this book, or someone with a different timeline who didn't really need emotionally to finish this book would continue to wait for things that are happening right now, like common prosperity and those types of things, to incorporate those into this argument, because I do think that they fit with the argument in kind of really interesting and nice ways. That being said, I think if I waited, the reason I'm not waiting is that news continues to move forward, time continues to pass, and one essentially has to cut the line at some point in time. I already, as was alluded to, I've already kind of thought about COVID and connected it to the arguments of this book in some ways, and so the conclusion does have a significant section on COVID, but that's where I'm drawing the line. I can't keep on kind of waiting for time to pass and more of it to fit into this already long manuscript. So let me jump. I assume that there is some familiarity in general with the China, in this audience in particular, with kind of China's general growth story. It is a kind of a major kind of geopolitical fact that China went from kind of an economy where it was desperately impoverished to and a relatively insignificant global economy to one that is the world's second largest, by some metrics, the largest already in the world in terms of economic activity as measured by purchasing power parity, and is kind of like the world's greatest trading partner, and is a major player in almost all facets of economic life. So assuming that that is relatively familiar background, and the ways in which the cadre evaluation system in part was part of that story, that is the ways in which local officials were judged on these quantified kind of limited set of quantified kind of metrics, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which that system kind of its problems and the kind of like the blind spots that kind of crept up. I've used this quote from Li Keqiang numerous times in a 2016 article. I quote it titled "Juking the Stats," which people don't get the reference to anymore, but it's a TV show, The Wire, which I highly recommend if anyone enjoys watching old school, high quality television. The idea was juking the stats, faking statistics. And so Li Keqiang was quoted in WikiLeaks in a release from a cable from 2007. GDP figures are man-made and therefore unreliable. All other figures, especially GDP statistics, are for reference only, he said, smiling. And so the idea that even though the system is based on the idea that GDP growth, über alles, that this is what matters, there is a recognition inside of the system that the quality of that data, that if you have a key performance indicator that determines people's promotions and their career chances, and they also have ability to kind of like manipulate that number, that there might be some manipulation in that number. And so this is the chapter that kind of looks at the problems of that limited quantified vision. First, I think it's important to note that in order to have a system that really focuses on kind of a limited quantified vision, you need to think about controlling the information environment. If you have a free and open media environment, or you have political opposition who can kind of raise and complain, then you can't necessarily operate in the same way that the Chinese government did. But the Chinese government hasn't necessarily always agreed on the proper way to the limits of control, or the extent of control of that information environment. Zhu Rongji, who is a wonderful quote and has said kind of many things that are kind of interesting, and the book is peppered with quotes from him, said, "Publicity, we've often said, should be primarily report positively and primarily publicize achievements, but it constrains us. What does it mean? Should it be 99% positive? Wouldn't 98% do, or 80%? And he wonders, perhaps even 51%. If it were only 51% good news, wouldn't that be correct as well? To use another dated reference, although I guess there's a remake or an extension, and so no longer as dated, the Matrix uses the movie The Matrix, kind of talks about the idea of kind of humans wouldn't accept a perfect reality, and so we had to make it messy for them. Similarly, a propaganda apparatus that put out perfect imagery would not be seen or taken as seriously as one that kind of accepted and acknowledged the limits, and kind of like that there were acknowledged that there were imperfections in society. So what are the local harms and hidden things that the system of limited quantified vision kind of like proliferated in its blind spots? One, if your goal is to maximize economic activity, you may not necessarily care about pollution, using up environmental resources, polluting the air, the commons, water, soil, releasing kind of like pollutants into these environments. If those are relatively unmeasured or kind of not as critical to one's promotion chances, then whereas economic activity is, then you might prioritize economic activity, even a massive polluter, over the environment in your community. A second is local protectionism, that local officials in China were promoted based on their own economic activity in the jurisdictions that they kind of examined and the fiscal resources that they were able to obtain. And so you might be interested in promoting your own economic activities from your own locality as opposed to those from neighboring localities. So we do see this kind of local protectionism in, for instance, kind of like kind of like tax abatements or these types of things in the Chinese case, but also in the United States case. So for instance, in kind of, you see competition with states offering incentives for factories to be located on, say, the southern Michigan side of the Indiana-Michigan border rather than the northern Indiana side. And these types of kind of like pitting of territories against each other can be rational at the local level, but irrational at the central level. Similarly, you have overcapacity as kind of localities kind of continue to produce for kind of in order to produce GDP. They're not necessarily thinking about what might be reasonable or rational at the national level. You see this in particular in urbanization issues, the simultaneous emergence of slums and ghost cities. So here you can think of kind of this idea of slums as populations, kind of migrant populations who are not necessarily incorporated in the cities. They're not necessarily in the GDP per capita data. They're not necessarily part of this quantified apparatus that local governments care about. And so they are relatively easy to ignore or overlook. Whereas ghost cities are the opposite situation, where the kind of physical infrastructure of the city is constructed because that helps GDP numbers and looks modern, even if it doesn't necessarily house as many people as you might imagine. And so this kind of simultaneous existence of kind of like massive or populations who are not part of the statistics and kind of like structures that look like a city that don't house people is an interesting, I argue, consequence of this quantified vision. Kind of the more kind of like basic issues that the Chinese government has faced, and which you still see in headlines from time to time, are kind of the massive amounts of local debt that governments were incurring in order to promote GDP, as well as individual firms like Evergrande that just is in the midst of collapsing at the moment, in part because of the same development ghost city idea that was just mentioned. And finally, corruption. That this is if what is happening is this limited vision, this vision is limited not just in terms of kind of what is being focused on, which numbers, but also the center is not paying that close of attention. And if you are going to make deals with your brother or your uncle in order to kind of like get the growth to happen, that presents an opportunity for massive corruption. And we have seen massive corruption inside and during the rise of China, what Yuanyuan Ong refers to as China's Gilded Age, and the corruption entailed in that. And finally, you do have direct data falsification, which is something that I've written about previously. And so some of these are easier to depict than others. So pollution is something that is very obvious and was particularly kind of like came to the head in 2010 and 2012 as urban air pollution became unbreathable, unlivable. I'm sure that many of you have experienced kind of like the difficult air quality indices of Chinese cities. Ghost cities are also this kind of very interesting kind of visual, the idea of kind of like built structures and infrastructure without a lot of occupying population. And then falsification is something that I wrote about in a piece that was mentioned in the British Journal of Political Science about GDP falsification in the provincial level in China. and the book also talks about to some extent. And so this is not just some outside diagnosis that Jeremy Wallace came up with. This is this idea that the system was producing kind of like was problematic in some ways is a diagnosis the regime itself had. So in 2007, when Jiabao, who in 2013 is talking about the successes and continued quantified vision, kind of acknowledges that the system itself is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. And that each of these sometimes referred to as the four uns. And kind of this idea that there's too much investment, too much saving, too much debt, that there's too much inequality and urban-rural divides in China, that it's uncoordinated, that you have regional fragmentation as you have kind of local overprotection. Like every city can't be the next Silicon Valley, for instance. That was a kind of major play that governments were making. Unsustainable kind of environmental degradation, and kind of that this is kind of can't go on forever. And so in 2007, he makes this statement. And so you might imagine that kind of what happened over the next 6 years, why was there not direct movement on these issues? And the answer to that is quite simple, that there was a global financial crisis and the regime faced a real threat. If its legitimacy was based at some level on performance, on GDP, the global financial crisis threatened China and kind of led it to double down on its kind of state-led development and kind of like debt-fueled economic growth pattern. And so we don't know what would have happened absent the global financial crisis. We don't know what amazing policy innovations the Hu Jintao and Jiabao administration would have come up with. Instead, we have this run of history. And what we see instead is a neopolitical turn, but only under the new administration in 2012, 2013 under Xi Jinping, who comes into office in 2012. And one of the kind of like interesting quotes that he gave around that time was this idea of, or a speech that was leaked, I believe, was the idea that like, why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? Why did the Soviet Communist Party collapse? The idea that he was interested in the possibility of collapse is important to think about. And he concludes, in the end, nobody was a real man. Nobody came out to resist. But there's no, while there have been some moves towards masculinity and kind of like emphasizing masculinity in Chinese politics, and I think there has been a real kind of symbolic move towards an analysis of strength. The moves have been kind of also on the economic side. And so I'll talk a little bit about this neopolitical turn. I realize I'm going very long, and so I don't want to kind of like cut the conversation in Q&A short. The one thing I do want to begin with, though, when we think about China's neopolitical turn and the direction that it's taken, again, this audience is probably quite familiar with the ways in which kind of it's often in the news, China being now a major global economic power, it's kind of like turbulations make headlines globally. I do want to emphasize that the turn that China has taken was not inevitable, that there were a lot of debate inside of China and a lot of different interpretations about where the regime was going to head, even in 2012, 2013. And so one of these is, and so this quote from kind of a 2011 quote, kind of China is in the midst of a fierce clash between different ideas. And that these are about kind of what direction the Chinese government and the Chinese people will take. One kind of gloss on these is referred to as the cake debate, interested in kind of equity versus growth. That is, are you interested in kind of divvying up the cake differently, kind of so, or are you interested in growing the cake or the pie? So in the US, we talk about pie. In China, we tend to talk about cake. Kind of growing it so that everyone gets more down the line, or are you interested in redividing it today, with Chongqing being associated with equity and equity focus, and Guangdong associated with a more of a growth orientation. But this is only kind of the most simple gloss, kind of along a left-right political spectrum, but there's a lot of different debates, from kind of a China model based on nationalism, statism, populism. There was Maoist nostalgia and new leftism, social democracy, kind of a liberal constitutionalism, neo-Confucianism. The world was really, there was a lot of debate and a lot of different ideas that were in the midst at this time. And the particular set of arguments and directions that were taken were idiosyncratic. When Xi Jinping came into office, he was an inkblot. People kind of projected upon him what they thought. Some saw him as kind of a red second generation, that he was the child of a high-level government official and was kind of committed to doctrinaire communism in a way that we wouldn't expect, perhaps. Others saw him as a basketball-loving kind of person who like wowed the people of Iowa when he visited as a local government official, and thought that he was cajolable, that he was kind of not that bright, and that you could like others could make him do what they wished. So this idea that Xi Jinping was this like necessarily powerful figure who was going to remake Chinese politics was not obvious from the start. And you do see a lot of uncertainty in this kind of initial year, with lots of different directions, lots of different kind of feints and moves. And I can't talk about all of these different pieces, but a different, like, kind of, you really did see kind of some things from the beginning that have stuck through, like the China Dream slogan that Xi Jinping is very associated with, the anti-corruption campaign, which is critical to understanding this movement. But he also engaged in a Southern tour, a kind of a pro-capitalist kind of movement, evoking something that Deng had done in the early 1990s following Tiananmen. You saw lots of different moves that had different interpretations, and kind of like people were guessing in lots of different ways, ending with this third plenum, which again was seen as this major kind of reform document that suggested that China was going to kind of engage in kind of a more kind of open private sector, kind of a move towards more similar to kind of global neoliberalism, kind of getting the state and the party out of politics. When in fact, a lot of the moves have turned out to be in the opposite direction. Again, even those with kind of like insight into the regime are extremely confused. This is even October 2013, that it was not obvious the ways that this was going to go. For some, it was increasingly obvious that the regime was going to cut down on corruption, that it was no longer going to allow political officials to grab the wealth of the people. And so our anti-hero Zhou Benshun from the introduction, who kind of laments his GDP focus, that is not enough to save him. By 2015, he is detained by the Discipline Inspection Commission, and kind of like his broadcasted confession in 2016, with kind of fascinating details about the extent to which his kind of like he had someone to look after his, like a full-time person to look after his pets and his pet turtle, who was buried with Buddhist scrolls. So the kind of opulence of the Chinese officialdom has been laid bare with this anti-corruption campaign, and was sentenced to 15 years in detention. This neopolitical turn I characterize as personalized, centralized, and partyized, increased monitoring, increased anti-corruption campaign, kind of a lot of repression, increased surveillance, with a serious emphasis on morality and tradition, and I would argue and strength as well. And this kind of neopolitical turn is a fix and a hedge. One of the ways you can think about what was going on in China is that if growth is slowing in part because of corruption, if corruption is one of the causes of slowing growth, then perhaps anti-corruption can fix the growth issues and can continue China's growth trajectory, and performance legitimacy can continue to operate for the regime. Improved governance might fix concerns regarding living standards in people's lives. But this kind of neopolitical turn is also a hedge. Moving away from output-based justifications makes sense if you feel the output numbers are likely to decline. So moving away from GDP growth at a period when GDP growth is going to decline or even fall, as it did in 2020 with COVID, this is kind of makes political sense. You've seen real repression in the regime, both in the kind of activists and NGO sector, but also obviously and perhaps most kind of like notoriously for minority communities, such as happening in Xinjiang with the expansion of labor and re-education camps. And so that's kind of where the book goes. As I said, I kind of touch on the COVID example and what it means in this kind of informational and kind of ideological space in Chinese politics. And I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, but I didn't want to go overly long here. So what I think the kind of argument of the book in the end is that this kind of China's limited quantified vision was an able tool that worked for decades and was kind of like quintessential to the Chinese economic growth project and the Chinese Communist Party's kind of like political durability. But problems accumulated in its blind spots until changes were required. The nature of those changes was debated, and I would argue remains so to this day. And with that, I look forward to kind of like hearing your questions and kind of continuing the conversation. So thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for a fantastic lecture. You covered a lot of ground, and you gave us, I think, a good sense of what we can expect in this book when it comes out, hopefully next year or soon thereafter. So it seems like questions are already coming in. I will hold off on my chair's privilege to make sure we prioritize our audience questions. But to those who are in the audience who haven't yet posed a question, please do feel free to use the Q&A function. I'm going to start just very briefly with a pre-submitted question because we got a couple that came in even before you started, just to show how much red hot excitement there was. And one of these questions has to do with a topic that you mentioned very briefly in the preface to your talk. You mentioned that you didn't really take this all the way up to the present. Obviously, as an author, you have to decide when to say enough is enough and when to stop chasing the news and to get down and to finish the manuscript, which you're doing. But you mentioned that common prosperity, which has been so much in the news lately, this idea of a more equal wealth distribution and a sort of economic justice or a moral economy framing has become very prominent lately. And so one of our pre-submitted questions asks you to kind of interpret in the framework of the book this recent push for common prosperity. Is this part of this neopolitical turn? And if so, in what ways does it sort of exemplify the logics that you're talking about?
So I certainly think that so again, thank you for acknowledging that this is, this I think fits with the arguments of the book, but it is, and in some ways strengthens the case that the system that had worked needed to be changed. The fact that the regime seems to be continuing to change its policies and kind of its economic direction is, I think, consistent with the arguments of the book, and so increases my confidence in those initial claims. But I have to draw the line sometime. The plan was to do 1978 to 2018, a nice 40-year period, and then COVID, and I was like, well, as long as nothing happens in 2019, early 2020, it'll be fine. And then we all know that that was the great before, and now we're in this different period. Common prosperity continues this idea of kind of like a shift in orientation away from growth über alles or GDPism towards shifting a kind of like emphasis, a justification that is about individual living standards, is about kind of signaling that the party is for the people. I think one of the reasons why it's difficult to incorporate is that I think while the rhetoric is there, it's unclear exactly what the actual policies are or will be, and the extent to which this is propaganda, or the ratio between propaganda and kind of economic reality. Is this kind of an actual accurate description of the policies that are being implemented in China, or is it a fascinating kind of propaganda play in a controlled media environment where we don't necessarily really know what the details are until years afterward? And so in that sense, it's very hard for me to incorporate it. But I do think that the idea that the rhetoric is shifting in this kind of like pro-equality direction is certainly consistent with the claims and is fascinating. I do think that there is the inequality problems, the kind of like growth, unsustainability of the growth that China was experiencing is a real phenomenon, and the regime understood it, the population understood it. And common prosperity, I think, is one of the ways in which they are trying to kind of argue that they're kind of acknowledging these problems and shifting direction.
Thank you very much. So let me turn to a question that's come in from Jonathan Noble, our interim director of the Liu Institute. Jonathan says, excellent presentation. I'm curious, have you looked into how international comparative statistics comparing China to other countries are used by the Chinese government? China's GDP versus India's, for example. Are these kinds of comparative statistics also important to bolster political legitimacy, enhance nationalism, and so forth? So I wonder if you could say a bit about that, because obviously there's so much of the kind of domestic jockeying or horse racing between different localities to outmatch one another in terms of GDP. Does it matter internationally as well?
So I do think so. I do think that there is a use of international statistics. So I may have to welcome my cat into this presentation if it continues to be so loud. Usually it's not a problem for me. They don't usually care if I close the door. So the idea of international statistics and the extent to which the Chinese regime uses them is definitely part of their rhetorical apparatus. The pride with which this Chinese state talks about moving up to second internationally in GDP rankings was definitely part of those GDP headlines that were in the People's Daily. There is a real sense in which they definitely use international acclaim to their own benefit, often quantified in its nature. So 2 points I would want to point out. One, for instance, something that I've looked at recently, not directly in the book manuscript, but the kind of in thinking about China's climate change politics, the carbon neutrality announcement that Xi Jinping made last year in around this time a year ago to the UN was kind of like was broadcast domestically, was something that was talked about, but most of the coverage, especially at the national level, was talked about in the international acclaim that China had been had received for this promise that he was going to make, not about what it actually meant politically, like in terms of the way it would change people's lives in China, or even the benefits that would accrue domestically if the air pollution were reduced and these types of things, but instead this international status that was gained by China making this quantitative claim. The second is there's been a recent kind of brouhaha scandal, I don't know exactly what we want to call it, about the doing business rankings, the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking, right? I think that's right. And that the scandal there, which your audience may be familiar with, was that the director of the World Bank at the time was someone, or now the director of the IMF, who was a head honcho at the World Bank at the time, was concerned that China's ranking in these ease of doing business was going to go down significantly over the course of kind of this annual ranking, and that they thought that might be problematic for China, and kind of tried to kind of finagle the statistics to juke the stats in some way to do this. And so that again is more evidence that yes, China did kind of derive, or at least it did use these numbers in its own discourse as part of, or saw it, at least some bureaucrats saw it as part of this kind of like performance legitimacy or armor of numbers that the state used.
Thank you. So let me again put the call out to our audience. I know we have, for example, a number of students who I'm sure have burning questions and want to raise questions. So let's get some of those into the queue. In the meantime, we have a question that just came in from Professor Carrie Kazel. Carrie is curious to know to what extent the strategy of seeking truth and hiding facts is driven by economic development, or whether it's a recycling of earlier tactics, and points out that China grew its GDP at the expense of the environment until environmental costs were too serious to ignore or hide. However, don't autocrats always hide information from the public, especially information that reflects poorly on those who rule? Thinking of occasions like the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah, I do think that's right. I think there are always information problems under authoritarianism, and that ubiquity of kind of like information problems and uncertainty is not the real focus here. What I'm trying to focus on, and I see as a difference between Maoist uncertainty and Maoist information or quantitative politics, and kind of like Deng era or kind of reform era quantitative politics, is this idea of limited quantified vision, that the state was kind of willing to allow, that it intentionally limited, that it knew by allowing local government officials kind of space to operate as long as they hit these benchmarks. They knew that corruption was going to be a problem, and they kind of acknowledge that, but also acknowledge that they're not going to, there is no kind of like smoking gun where it's like, we're definitely going to allow corruption to take place under the system, but there are acknowledgements that we don't have the personnel in order to adequately manage this kind of like these possibilities of corruption. And so in that sense, I think it's a clear kind of acknowledgement that the state is intentionally limiting its vision. It is not doing everything it can to kind of suss out the possibilities of corruption because it's worried that doing so will stifle innovation and kind of like energy. Initiative is the word or is the English translation of Deng's terms. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that while kind of like all states use statistics, in fact, the term statistics comes from like the reason statistics the word it is because states. There is a different political kind of apparatus that happened that was associated with this limited quantified vision that is different and distinct from Maoist politics, even though there's lying in all different types of systems. I do think that the limited nature of this system under Deng is distinct, and that's one difference that I would draw.
Right. Okay. Going in a slightly different direction, we've just got a question in from one of our students. So from Javier Rivera Gonzalez, who asks, has Xi Jinping significantly changed the structure of the Chinese bureaucracy to help pursue these new goals, this neo-political turn that you've described? Mm-hmm. If so, or if not, how has this helped or hindered these policy goals?
There have definitely been bureaucratic changes. So as I was racing through the neo-political turn, I didn't get into a lot of the details that the manuscript tries to, the book tries to. In particular, I think the ones that are most obvious or important are the kind of increased centralization of monitoring and increased monitoring. The CCDI, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, a party-based organization, has become much stronger, has a bigger bureaucratic footprint, is kind of present in doing investigations, investigating higher level officials. All of those changes are kind of like, that's only the kind of the tip of the iceberg of the bureaucratic changes that have happened. But I think probably the most revealing in the sense that the center is going to watch you more closely, and you as a local official are not necessarily going to have the freedom to operate that you used to have. And that kind of reorientation and centralization of power has had real consequences inside the regime. A lot of people have written about the extent to which local government officials feel scared to move, to make decisions because they are worried about being seen as corrupt. If you're going to make a kind of like build a new piece of infrastructure in your community, and you know the developer and they've taken you out to dinner, but you don't think it's corrupt necessarily, you don't know if the center is going to agree with that assessment, and so you might prefer not to move than to move. So centralization, again, the neo-political turn is not without its own costs. It has kind of its own political risks and its calculus, but it is seen as a way to try to deal with the problems that prior system made. And so I think that like one can actually see this in the COVID case as well, that if politics is centralized, then then what happens is Xi Jinping's fault, right? To his credit when things succeed, but also to his fault when things fail. And so there was a period of time in January, February 2020, where the COVID crisis was a dramatic failure for the Chinese state, and exactly the kind of information collapse that happens when you don't have decentralization, when you have a center who is kind of omnipotent and kind of looking down and constraining, even if there are still limitations, the actual factual knowledge that the center has, this image of a center who is portraying itself as all controlling and all knowing, really sets the regime up for failure. And I think it's only the kind of like comparative failure of Western European states and the United States that kind of turned what could have been a real political disaster for the regime into a success. So that's that kind of like gets at this political dynamic. But yes, the basic question, the easy answer is yes, there have been real bureaucratic changes up and down the system that have been kind of personified and substantiated this neo-political turn. It's not just a discourse turn. It is a real political and economic turn.
So let me ask my own follow-up if I can interject briefly. And a question I wanted to ask you anyways, but which I think fits with this, is the question of why not just more quantification or more multidimensional quantification? As you talked about, the bureaucratic capacity of the center seems to be increasing. We see more verticalization in some ministries. We see an expanded, a more powerful, national commission for supervising cadres. We see a beefed up CCDI, discipline inspection system you've just mentioned. We also see, startling advances in digital surveillance capability, in remote sensing capability. If the regime wants to, it can monitor officials quantitatively, right, as well as kind of qualitatively or ideologically in new ways. So why do you think the judgment was made that in addition to new dimensions or new types of quantified measurement and incentives, holding officials accountable that way, not just in a limited way as you describe it, in a sort of more broad way with more indicators, why was the choice made to move towards something that is explicitly kind of political, that has an ideological character, that emphasizes the building of a particular mindset or temperament on the part of officials, rather than this more technocratic approach, kind of embellished and updated, for 2021?
Yeah. So I think this is a characteristically great question. I do think it is accurate, and one of the changes, I think, you notice the kind of one sentence version is the idea that kind of like a few numbers came to define Chinese politics. And I think I used to just say numbers came to define Chinese politics, but it is this idea that the state is not giving up on numbers or quantification at all. It's giving up on limited quantification that I want to kind of shift as an emphasis. I think rhetorically it's better, it works nicer as a sentence, but the facts kind of shape the text here. I do think that there is a real effort to quantify. And so I'll separate into two parts. One, kind of like the digital surveillance or quantify everything thing, and then a cadre evaluation system. So actually, when you look at the I didn't get into it because it's in chapter 5, but the cadre evaluation system really changes initially under the who-when regime, that you have a real expansion of the number of indicators that government officials are kind of like in their annual scorecards, that you really see a ballooning of them, kind of on equality issues, increasingly on kind of party issues, on environmental issues. But these are no longer just a few kind of like easy output metrics, and whoever gets the most grain and industrial development gets promoted. That there was a real attempt to increase the number of metrics. What they saw was that with the core metrics still being there, the GDP numbers, the core economic metrics still dominating the system, even with the addition of these extra numbers as part of the quantified system, they did not see the kind of behavioral changes at the local level that they wished. I think that Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao really did think that they were trying to reform the system, but they either didn't have the political capital or the will or the knowledge that simply adding more of these metrics would get a better balance to these other indicators, as opposed to just focusing on the older ideas of environmental or kind of economic growth. So I think that part of it was the failure of this kind of like more subtle, simple kind of change, like kind of like, we're going to expand the number of indicators, and that should lead to better bureaucratic performance across a wider set of dimensions, policy dimensions. That fails, that does not change behavior sufficiently. Maybe that failure is, again, part of the global financial crisis, like is part to blame there, that it was heading in the right direction, but we don't get to run history twice. By 2012, it was seen as kind of the debt problems were expanding, and the need to shift more categorically was needed. I think there is a real inclination towards quantifying everything in Chinese politics, and I think that Xi Jinping seems to be not a technocrat, but a technophile. He seems to be very interested in kind of believing technology can solve all problems, and kind of that he doesn't have to deal with messy people. I do think there's probably some scars of the Cultural Revolution there, that he would prefer an algorithm to a person at almost any time. And I do think that this state is trying to quantify kind of individual level performance in citizens as well. While the social credit system is mostly kind of an idea, and kind of like I talk about the Black Mirror analogy is kind of going too far, and this is not actually kind of inside the capacity of the Chinese state as of 2021, and probably not as of 2025. There is like a vision, I think, that at least some inside of the state, and perhaps Xi Jinping himself, have of kind of pushing good behavior by citizens through massive quantification on all fronts. But I don't think that that is the dominant that is not the dominant presentation of what is happening. What is instead, I think, is this like strength, is kind of equality, is kind of process and kind of like purity of politics, morality, anti-corruption, right? So it's a shift. They've decided they can't just say, we're focusing on kind of like growth and quantifying everything, and that's going to be the way we do this. We're going to, it's been a rhetorical shift that they needed to do, that they felt that they needed to do politically, that the mere technocratic shift of we're going to quantify more things and that's going to change performance was deemed insufficient.
Thanks. A really enlightening answer. And I think that does help kind of explain that sort of transitional period, this bumpy transition. And as you said, what effect the intervention of the global financial crisis had in bringing economic targets back to the fore, we'll never really know. That counterfactual is hidden. Okay, let me turn to some of the questions that have just come into our feed. One is a very big picture question. It's the $1 million question, of course, in Chinese politics. Could you please comment on what looks like Xi Jinping's attempt to make himself a lifelong ruler in the CCP? And I'll ask you to narrow that a little bit by sort of relating it to this notion of the neopolitical turn. Is this a kind of concomitant of a neopolitical turn, a leader who wants to really entrench himself in this way? Is this a necessary component of that? Or is there any other way you would make sense of what may be this effort by Xi to install himself for a longer period, if not life?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why the book needs to finish is that the longer it takes, there will be this, we are up for another party Congress in 2022, where Xi's third term, or Xi's expected third term, is likely to come and would have to be incorporated. And so it's one of these things that as time turns, it's hard to think about not including. And so I need to finish it so that I can finish, so that the book can be done before everything is about Xi's third term or non-third term, if that were to happen. When it became clear that the kind of the term limits were abolished in 2017, that this was something that kind of, it looked like she was setting herself up for a third term or multiple terms or lifelong rule. It breaks one of the kind of like core ideas of the early reform era, which was quantitative in its nature, the idea that there were kind of like rigid rules of retirement based on age and institutionalized turnover. And this was a real interesting political project at the beginning of the reform era, because you have this really kind of like crazy politics at the end of the Cultural Revolution, where where the kind of radicals had pushed out a large number of officials who were older and near retirement age. Those officials get brought back in just to be told to retire. And that kind of story is one of these interesting ones about kind of regimes and who they are and why they are, is kind of an interesting kind of debate that I go into earlier in the manuscript. And it draws connections to what is happening today with kind of the abolition of those. So the idea that this is, if Xi Jinping doesn't have to follow these rules anymore, what about the age limits for all of the other kind of like political levels inside of the regime? How is the elite bargain going to survive in that system? And perhaps it will, and it will exist without any problem. The final thing I'll say on this point is that I think from Xi's perspective, if you are going to break a lot of eggs in order to make the omelet, even if the regime has given you the authority, the elites inside of the regime have given you the authority to do so, and you've run with it, you might be concerned about giving up the kind of official reins of power. Sorry, my lighting solutions are failing a little bit.
As long as the sky isn't falling.
Yeah, the sky is literally falling. Books are falling from the sky. So you might worry about stepping down and being the target from like a new generation of leaders who are upset that you attacked them and their brethren or prevented them from their rightful promotions. So I can imagine a dictator being very kind of leery of stepping down. On the other hand, you might get the opposite. You might get she stepping down from formal positions, but having all of the power informally. And so it's really, again, it's really going to be an interesting discussion and an interesting kind of set of events to watch, but it's unknown at this time.
Great. Well, thank you. So let me shift to the next question, which comes from Wayne Wong. And this is a great question because it gets at another kind of leg of the accountability structure. You talked a lot about, sort of quantitative metrics as having the strength that they are one way to hold officials accountable. They can be gamed, they can be juked, but at the end of the day, it's tricky to get away with complete falsification of data, or at least it's hard to get away with it for a really long period of time, or it's hard to fool all the people all the time in any case. So the question here is whether the increase in propaganda and increasingly limited public debate capacity under Xi Jinping's administration corresponds to the departure from an older system where public opinion supervision over local officials' performance was also playing a more significant role. So in addition to just these quantitative metrics, there were also experiments with creating a larger role for public supervision, some of this in an institutionalized way by allowing more citizen consultation, or even TV programs on state television where mayors had to sit down in front of the public and answer to the public if things looked bad in their jurisdiction, but also informally, of course, as new kinds of social media cropped up online, as the internet grew and developed in China, and there were voices online as well that could, to some extent, hold leaders to account, or at least express discontent or express opinions about the leadership. Now, we've seen a reining in of that sort of sphere of discussion, certainly under Xi Jinping, a much more sort of sternly controlled public sphere. How does that relate to all this? Is that the foreclosing of that other type of accountability, or are there ways in which we'll see continued public opinion supervision working under Xi?
Yeah. So I imagine that some of the bureaucratic and institutionalized pieces of public opinion supervision, like mayors' mailboxes and these types of things, are unlikely to be deleted completely from the political environment. But I do think that they are probably being hollowed out by to what extent are citizens actually feeling free to speak, or are allowed to organize through non-governmental organizations in ways to collect data in order to kind of make the case that change needs to happen, or that this is a failure, a policy failure, that it's being atomized in this way. Society is being atomized, and so individuals might be able to write to the mayor's mailbox, but the extent to which that is actually going to affect political change, I think, is not as strong as it was. The manuscript kind of focuses on, there's an interesting kind of connection to public opinion supervision that goes back to the 1980s, where kind of in quantified terms, the extent to which surveys were being used and kind of as part of the discourse, as part of the collection of understanding of what the citizens wanted, from shifting from a Maoist period. This is again one of those differences between Maoist era statistics and kind of reform era statistics, where kind of you had a kind of like an idea of capturing all data, or going in and talking to the correct person, and that person gives you a sense about what is the kind of the right data versus random samples. And so you have a similar to the GDPism graph that you have, the kind of in the 1980s, you have a nice graph about sample survey, that term used in kind of like People's Daily. You similarly see kind of a rise into 1989 and then a drop off thereafter. And the argument there is that when the state started collecting data through surveys, it started seeing that their reforms were popular, and it started to justify and use that popular support, as indicated by surveys, as a measure of their popularity. But doing so, at least for some, indicated that that is a requirement now, that what do the public think of this? And it kind of led to further calls that unless the public is supportive, then perhaps this policy should not be done, / the consultation needs to happen with the public beforehand, before a policy. That once you start incorporating public discourse and public statistics into your public opinion, into your kind of justification, that went down a bit too far for the regime, and you see a move away from that in the 1990s. So this kind of idea about public opinion supervision, I think you see a real shift in the 1990s to kind of public opinion supervision used to kind of control or manage, kind of like to shape public opinion as opposed to justify policies. And then in the 2000s, under the golden era of the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao administration, I do think you saw a real opening up of public opinion supervision, consultation, and I think just under the neopolitical turn, you're really seeing a hollowing out of those institutions.
Thank you. So we have time, I think, for one, maybe two more questions, depending on how things go. So maybe I can ask you to be just very brief. You've done a great job at answering complicated questions succinctly, but let me see if we can get two more questions in here. So this next question, I think, really cuts to the heart of your thesis here, and I think it's good for clarifying what you're arguing in this book. So this is a question from Peitong Jing. Professor Wallace, how would you define whose truth and whose facts are sought or hidden? The government officials from a lower level often hide facts from their bosses at a higher level. Sometimes maybe nobody really knows what the facts are. It seems that it is not simply the government that is hiding facts from the public. This is a question about truth and facts and for whom. So could you speak a little bit to this? Because I think it does get to the really central ideas in your work.
Yeah, no, I do think that it was not always the case, for instance, that local governments knew that they were, by supporting their local industries, that they were destroying the environment around them, right? It was not kind of a knowing kind of like back and forth that they were, that no one was collecting that data. There was no, that there was not an interest in or kind of acknowledgement of the potential that these things should be collected. Just like I'm sure 20 years from now, we will look back on all of the things that we're not collecting in 2021. There is always a recognition, like kind of, there's always more ancillary kind of like results of the effects that we have. So one, there is a limited sense, like all data is limited, all facts, facts that states have are limited. The truth of the matter is like, at some level is an objective reality that is happening in the world. Our understanding of that objective reality is a matter of political discussion and is kind of necessarily interpretivist in some ways, that it's who sees what and who counts what. So there is a sense in which the seeking truth and hiding facts from the title, it's a play, right? So seeking truth is this kind of like from this Chinese expression, seek truth from facts. So the idea was that the outputs, the results of policies are what should be judged and should justify policies, as opposed to some prior theoretical apparatus. So the idea was that it's outputs that matter. And this is often glossed as pragmatism, the pragmatism of Deng. What the hiding facts, what I add there is that in fact, what the state was not necessarily always interested in kind of like finding truth in all forms, but created a system that was limited and quantified and allowed for the hiding of facts in order initially to seek this greater truth, to seek this goal of growth. They kind of like sought that and were willing to allow for facts to be hidden that were costly. So that's the play of the title. Whether it works or doesn't work, I don't have a big disquisition about the nature of truth in the book, and even cut down on the extent to which that kind of like the initial practices the sole criterion of truth debate from the late 1970s, given that readership, there was some concern that readers might not be interested in the full extent of that debate, theoretical communist debate from the late 1970s in 2021. So that section was cut back on, but I do think that these are the fact that the title has these kind of like big ideas is because I do think that the subject matter is about kind of these big ideas that I'm trying to tackle relatively big questions in this book rather than relatively narrow ones, and that's a strength and a weakness, because when you try to tackle big questions, it's hard to do everything justice. But I'm trying to bring a lot of different perspectives together in this piece.
Well, I think that's about as much time we have. So, and that's a good note to end on, because these are good. You're speaking of the big picture, and this is the big picture also of this work. I think the proof is in the pudding, and the title clearly attracted a lot of people to today's talk, so we were glad to welcome a number of audience members. We hope to see you again. I want to take this opportunity to thank Professor Wallace for a really fascinating lecture, for what looks to be a really interesting study that will be coming out soon, so keep your eyes peeled for it. And thank you also for your thoughtful responses, Jeremy, to our audience questions. The next lecture on our Liu Institute series is going to feature a talk by Ravinder Kaur, who's going to discuss identity economy, capitalization of the nation in 21st century India. So another really fascinating, timely topic, but a quite different setting, as you see. That lecture will be held on Monday, November 15th at 12:30 via Zoom, and you can find more information at asia.nd.edu. Thank you very much, everybody, and we hope to see you again before long.